So actually I want to actually ask Salahuddin to bring a positive case, because we did not hear anything positive showing the thesis to be true, namely premise 2, which I will be defending. There is no good evidence to show that the Quran was divinely revealed. What we have seen so far is that we have historical evidence that support our notion, namely that he did borrow that from other sources. And I gave you 4 examples. And you didn't went into those 4 examples. You didn't actually go to the historical background of them. You didn't go to the dating, nor to the context. Your only rebuttal of your refutation was that they are not exactly the same. But nobody claimed that they were exactly the same. This is why it is called a parallel and not an exact copy. So I don't have anything actually to refute. So Salahuddin, I will give up my 5 minutes for you to actually make a positive case or go into the topic at hand, namely the historical evidence that we showed you, the dating, the scholars, and so on and so forth. I will release the mic.
We will now hear Muhammad. Thank you, Raphael, for giving him 5 minutes. Go ahead, Muhammad.
Okay. Well, I don't think Raphael is addressing me correctly. Well, number one, I did address the arguments that he brought. Number two, he failed to address the issue of the alternate source of the accusation that the Quran was copying from, or copied the story of Cain and Abel in chapter number 5 in the Targum Yerushalem, or the pseudo-Jonathan Targum, which mentioned the wives of Ishmael being Khadija, Fatima, and Aisha, thus having to originate post-Islam, and some scholars even date it to the time of the crucifixion. Oh, I'm sorry, the time of the Crusades. Number two, he went into misquoting Waxman. Well, Leopold Zolns in 1892, it says quite specifically that based on the similarities of the Shi'alot and Genealogic writings and presence of the Quraysh polemics, he drashed Tanhuma to the first half of the 9th century. Secondly, I did never misquoted Waxman. In fact, what you're saying is in fact in support of my point. Waxman is saying that it wasn't compiled completely until the late end of the 9th century. Now, this doesn't mean that it was not, the narratives mentioning Cain and Abel did not include. You have to establish, and I asked you this a couple of times in my rebuttal, I asked you, give us a source, give us specific people, give us names, give us actual dates where the Prophet Muhammad met with this person, met with that person, and wrote down these narratives that we find in the Quran. What you're giving us, Raphael, is assumption. You're giving us, well, he possibly did this. I mean, there's a possibility that he met with this person and he it was recited to him the narratives that we find in the Quran. It's possible that this happened. Well, being possible does not mean that it's probable. We're speaking about what probably happened, and I mentioned this in my opening statement. You said that me mentioning he was illiterate, he couldn't have had me mentioning he was illiterate is a straw man, irrelevant to the topic at hand. If the Prophet Muhammad was illiterate, he couldn't have the books that you allege he had in his lap and a pen in the other and write down everything that he's saying. Okay, or write down everything that we find in the Quran. So illiteracy is an important discussion. Number two, you said that me mentioning the languages he didn't understand is also irrelevant. Well, look at the quotation you posted above. You said that, let me repost what you're saying, okay? You posted this quotation, and this in fact is in support of my point. You said, but many more are due to misconceptions such as only a listener, not the reader of a book, could fall into, in that he was listening to the book that was being recited to him. Well, we know what languages the books are in. We know where they originated from. The books, the sources, are in languages that he couldn't only read and write, but he couldn't even understand. He couldn't understand those languages. So how were they recited to him? How? You're going on to tangents without addressing the base issue. Understand the basic issues. You mentioned that him being sincere is a straw man. It's not, or I'm sorry, you mentioned him being sincere. Your mentioning of him being sincere is a straw man of my argument. You're saying that he was speaking about harmonizing the Arab tribes. I'm sorry, this is not what your scholars say. This is not what any of the text says. This is something that you made up, Raphael, something that's unfounded in any of what I quoted. And a major quotation, here we go. Right here. Tor Andre is not saying that the Prophet Muhammad is a sincerely in support of uniting the Arab tribes, but rather he says the genuineness and sincerity of Muhammad's piety and the honesty of his belief in his religious call. Belief in his call and piety are indisputable. And then the quote of John Gilchrist, where he says, you didn't even address this one, but John Gilchrist says that we can safely reject the view that the Prophet Muhammad was a deliberate impostor. Well, I mean, the question still remains, and this is a big question. If the Prophet Muhammad was sincerely believing he was receiving revelations from Allah, he was sincerely thinking that he was a true prophet of God, how can he at the same time receive oral transmissions that he includes within his text or within the Quran? This is something that you cannot harmonize, and you completely failed to address this. Rather, you spent about 10 seconds on this. And the last issue that I want to use the extra time, the last issue that I want to use for the extra time, he allotted me extra 5 minutes. I'm going to utilize 1 minute out of those 5 minutes, and I'll grant him the 4 minutes back. Was Tales of the Ancients. You gave that accusation in your opening statement. You said, well, the Prophet Muhammad was accused of copying Tales of the Ancients. Well, number one, the Meccans were acquainted with their Ishmaelite roots. They knew that they received, or that they had a forefather, and that was Ishmael. And that Ishmael was on the religion, and that you are forcing the accusation of the Meccans to be Christian and Jewish roots, or the Talmud. Prove that they were speaking about Christian, Jewish, or Talmudic roots, and not the issue of the Ishmaelites. Secondly, they also accused him of being a magician. They also accused him of being a sorcerer. And these are all accusations, none more or nothing less. If you look in the hadith, there's a narration in where the Abu Jahl was in Mecca, and a person from Medina traveled to Mecca and encountered the Prophet Muhammad. Abu Jahl told the Prophet Muhammad, this man is speaking the truth, but because implying that he was not of his tribe, he is making these accusations against him. So these are nothing more than accusations, and you haven't addressed that issue at all. Mic is free. The rest of the time, you have 2 minutes. The rest of the time is all yours, man.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, first of all, notice again that Salahuldeen attacks a straw man, because my argument consists out of Muhammad receiving this revelation orally, not from a literary source. Now he states, but how can he receive this orally when he didn't understand the questions or didn't understand the languages? I already covered this issue in my opening statement. Namely, in Sahih al-Bukhari, it clearly records the following. Narrated Abu Huraira, the people of the scriptures, Jews, used to recite the Torah in Hebrew, and they used to explain it in the Arabic to the Muslims. On that, Allah's apostle said, do not believe the people of the scripture or disbelieve them, but say we believe in Allah and what is revealed to us. Now notice that the Jews went out of their way explaining to Muslims in their own language that what the Torah and their sources were all about. And Muhammad even warned them that must mean that he was familiar with it and that he heard it. And it was commonly placed as to yet when you see the word used to know or used to tell. So this was commonplace. Second of all, your silly notion that we have to identify these mysterious teachers is just fallacious. Let me illustrate that with an example. If I go to the desert and start digging up the earth and find arrows, can I then solidly conclude that this is actually made by human beings? Or do I have to identify those human beings before I can prove that this was intelligent designed? Of course not. We don't have to identify the cause for us to form a solid conclusion. We see that the sources are extremely identical. We see that Muhammad actually interacted with Christians, like the Sirah literature I gave you, the 3 Christians that were actually discussing the fact that Jesus were actually creating clay birds, that he was speaking in the cradle, and so on and so forth. So this interaction was happening. And we see the links and the identical nature of both scriptures. So to actually point out that we have to identify the mysterious teachers is fallacious on itself. Like in my illustration, I do not have to point to the civilization that created the errors. I just the errors to prove that there was a civilization, not the other way around. If I find pots and pans, I don't have to use the civilization to prove that they are pots and pans. I can use the pots and pans to prove that there was a civilization. So you are actually mixing the arguments, sir. And therefore your objection is fallacious. But notice again, we didn't read anything positive in the thesis. We didn't think any positive evidence to show that the Quran was divinely revealed. What I did was to show that there was historical documentation that clearly shows that Muhammad borrowed from other sources. Concerning Waxman, sir, let me quote and give you the exact quote, because you wanted the exact quote. Now let's give you the exact quote then. Let me open Waxman and to show what Waxman is actually saying. He is saying that this originates from the 4th century and it's even bearing the name of a 4th century person. Here we go, let me post it. Here we go. He states, Waxman, in the same book that you are actually utilizing, the following. Besides the cycle of Rabbah, a large midrashim and the Petachim, there exists other midrashic cycle on these books known as the Talmud Yubin. Okay, the first name given to it because of the numerous homiletic interpretation of verses quoted in the name of Tanhu. Proceeds in saying, let me post the relevant part of it. Here we go. Here we go. The son of Abba, a famous Palestinian agorist who lived towards the end of the 4th century. So it's actually bearing the name of a 4th century person, sir. Proving that it actually originates from the 4th century. So what Waxman was arguing is that it was actually finalized or compiled in the late 9th century, yet the text predates the Quran and actually originates from the 4th century. So again, I don't have any evidence to actually refute. You just critiqued mine, but your critiques were based on misunderstandings, red herrings, and straw men. So, again, I'm a bit disappointed that we didn't have a positive case that actually addressed the second premise I was able to defend tonight, or this afternoon. Namely, there is no good historical evidence to support that the Quran has been divinely revealed. Because we didn't have any evidence to offer, or we didn't get any evidence from my opponent this afternoon. I think very telling. So I want everybody that actually saw the debate go back to the sources that we used and to go after the source and to see if those dates predate the Quran, and if that is the case, is there borrowing? Is there something plagiarized? Okay. Let me just read myself. Mike's.
Thank you, Raphael. We will now hear each speaker's concluding statements. Just to recap on what we've heard so far, we've heard both of them. We've heard both of their opening statements, rebuttals, and counter-rebuttals. After the concluding statements, we will move forward to the question and answer session. Mohammed, go ahead, please.
Okay, and it seems that Raphael is either muting my responses or intentionally ignoring what I'm saying. I mentioned and I addressed the accusation that the Prophet Muhammad was being addressed orally.